So good afternoon. This is Erica Smith. I'm facilitating session 5B. Thank you, Michael from Equals. And I also saw Kanisha Hewitt from the ACCS. So today I'll be picking up on Module 5. 5A didn't come off as yet due to 0 attendance, but it's okay. It's scheduled for tomorrow. And the modules, the 2A and B, actually look at 2 distinct aspects of governance. So I'll be looking at governance from a micro level, or the level of the firm or organization, whilst Christina at 5A will be looking at it from a more political level. Sorry. Okay. So in this session, I'll be looking primarily at the key principles of governance for nonprofits, examples of governance approaches for nonprofits. And well, Kanisha, I don't know if it'll only be the 3 of us, but I wanted to have some discussion. Kanisha has problems with her mic. I wanted to have some discussion where we apply what was discussed to your organization. So we'll see how it goes. So the objectives are that on completion of this module, at least 5B, including the recommended reading, hopefully you'll be able to respond to the following and apply the concepts to your CSO and to your thinking in terms of the development of your advocacy plans, in terms of understanding whether your organization has the organizational or internal capacity to actually properly and in a sustainable manner apply what you're planning to do. So you should be able to evaluate the concept of good governance. What is it? Explain the model, the stakeholder model. There are different models. There's also the Carver policy governance model, which you should be able to assess, and describe the governance model used by your organization and evaluate its strengths and shortcomings. So these are just recommendations of what you should be able to do once you've done all the reading, etc. The most important part would be the last one, which is where you're applying it to your organization. The theory is okay, but it's not as important. So I wanted to start by having some input from you. I did say in the Google Classroom that I was hoping to get 3 responses. I don't know if that will be, but I wanted to find out first, do you know what I mean when I speak of governance? And I was hoping I don't know who there's a 3rd person, I'm not sure if that's Wendy, but I'm hoping that you would have at least taken a few minutes, if you weren't familiar with what governance is, to just check and to make some suggestions. So does anyone have any suggestions about what their understanding of governance is?
Hey, Erica. It is me joining as Pollock. That should be policy.
Okay. Well, of course I have responses. So when we're speaking about governance at the organizational or firm level, we're talking about, including other things, the roles and responsibilities of the boards. And here I have specified nonprofit boards. And I'll explain why I emphasize the nonprofit part other than the fact that, of course, your organizations are not for profit. We're talking about issues such as the board composition, things like size, race, gender, for those organizations which are active across multiple jurisdictions or different regions, demographic aspects. We're looking at the board staff relationship, the effectiveness of the board evolution and group dynamics, board recruitment, assessment and renewal, and the board and organizational performance. How does the board influence, or what effect does it have on organizational performance? So without even going any further, I can assume that these would be issues of substantial interest to your organizations. I'm sure I work for a nonprofit, and the issue of the board and how it influences performance in particular are very important issues for the organization I work with and generally throughout the Caribbean. I'm sure you would have heard some comments made from time to time concerning the challenges of good governance in the region. Please feel free to intervene if you have any queries. So often you will hear about corporate governance. And the reason we stress nonprofit is because corporate speaks to for-profit organizations. And that is described, corporate governance is described as a system by which companies are directed and controlled. And once you do the reading, and as we go through the session, you'll see that there are, of course, differences between for-profit organizations and nonprofits. And as such, we can make the assumption that there are some differences from a governance perspective. However, a lot of the research on governance for nonprofits has been strongly influenced by that on corporate governance. And the reality is there's been a lot more attention paid to the issue of corporate governance, especially following, I don't know your ages, but you may remember Enron. And Enron was a big scandal. And then more regionally or locally in Barbados, for example, years ago, you had the trade confirmers issue. And of course, most recently, you had CLECO. So the for-profit corporate governance issues have been at the forefront because of the sheer size and impact. Nonetheless, the governance of nonprofits have also stimulated and increasingly so a lot of interest. And you may have known that years ago, a few years back, Oxfam have had issue, and a number of the nonprofit organizations have had their challenges as well from a governance perspective. So the starting point for governance, and particularly corporate governance, has been based on what is known as agency theory and the problems of agency. This, although it has been the starting point for research on corporate governance, in fact, agency theory is broad enough that it also is of tremendous significance to nonprofits. So I don't know if any of this is familiar to you, but agency theory, simply put, concerns in the corporate setting the fact, and it comes out of economic theory, the fact that the firm, the company, a company, is usually or very often managed separately or managed by people other than the owners. So there's a separation between ownership and management. And the challenges that the managers who act as the agents of the owner do not always act in the best interest of the owners, or their interests may simply diverge. So good governance would seek to ensure that managers are acting in the best interest of the owners. Now, the challenge will arise or the question you have to respond to is whether the best interest or the interest of the owners and what is in the best interest of the company will coincide, because sometimes those are two divergent interests. And in the corporate setting, a big issue concerns where you have shareholders. So you will have minority shareholders who own just a few very small numbers of shares, and then the really big shareholders who may in fact own the majority of the company and may have distinct interests from those or divergent interests from those of minority shareholders. So the problems of agency concern resolving those. Now, if we think of agency vis-a-vis a CSO, you would see that it would still be applicable, because even though the CSO will not have the corporate objectives or the type of ownership structure that a company has, you will still have a board and management and stakeholders. You may have membership, and there will, like a corporate company, be a separation very often between the boards or the trustees and the stakeholders or the members. So in the case of the nonprofit firm or the nonprofit organization, the challenges of agency concern the extent to which the trustees or the board of directors are adhering or complying with the purpose or mission of the organization, and to what extent that there's a difference. So this concept of a stakeholder, you're working in a nonprofit scenario, you do not have owners as such or shareholders, but you will have stakeholders. And of course, for profit companies will also have stakeholders. So we need to understand what this means. And from the theory, we have the definition of a stakeholder being any group or individual who can affect, or is affected by the achievement of the organization's objectives. So any group or individual that has an interest in what the organization does. And the theory says that all persons or groups with legitimate interests participating in an enterprise do so to obtain benefits, and that there's no prima facie priority of one set of interests and benefits over another. So in simple words, Donaldson and Preston are arguing that all stakeholders have equal or are at an equal level within the organization. And this is something you should give thought to, because if you really start to map out who are your stakeholders. So you develop your communication and advocacy plan. What you would have worked on, why you would have focused on a specific problem. You have to think through, well, what is the impact on our stakeholders? That in turn means you must define and understand your stakeholders, understand their interests, what are their interests, what are the benefits they're looking for, and how effectively are you addressing those interests, in this case, specifically as it concerns your communications and advocacy plan. Are there any questions? Okay, I will continue. So, as I previously said, whilst most of the research has been on corporate or for-profit governance, you've seen theories being developed specifically for nonprofit organizations concerning their governance and ensuring that they're properly governed. So the theory states that unlike for-profit organizations, nonprofits have less incentives to behave opportunistically and to take advantage of consumers or stakeholders than a for-profit organization would. But the challenge is that very often the functions of most nonprofit organizations are very complex and difficult to define or to pinpoint. And as a result, it's very difficult to measure their output accurately. So tying this back into your communications and advocacy planning and planning generally, the question I would ask you is, how clearly defined are your objectives or the functions of your organizations? How well articulated are those? And do you have in place a system for evaluating and measuring the outputs of the actions you undertake? And of course, when you do your communications and advocacy plan, you should be thinking, that's why we started with priority setting and the problem tree, because we want to ensure that you're very, very clearly articulating the problem, the objectives, and as you work through that, how you're going to measure the impact of the action undertaken. So, in terms of the theory, one of the primary models is if you want to call it a model, the policy governance model, which is trademarked and owned by a couple, Carver and Carver, John Carver, and I believe it's his wife. And this model is one that focuses on organizational governance and seeks to achieve owner accountability within the organization and to guide appropriate relationships between the organization's owners or stakeholders, the board of directors, and the management. And importantly, it seeks to differentiate, and this is where boards often run into problems with management. The model focuses on differentiating between the role of management and the governance role of the boards. So managers manage and the board governs. And the model comprises of 10 principles. You will have to read upon these, but the first 3 principles address ownership, governance position, and the board, and looks at defining the organization's ownership, the responsibilities of the board, and the board's authority. Those are principles 1 to 3. Principles 4 to 7 specify that the board defines in writing policies identifying the benefits that should come about from the organization, how the board should conduct itself, and how staff should behave. So in Carver terminology, you have principle 4, which speaks on ends policies, where the board defines in writing the results, changes, or benefits that should come about for specified recipients, beneficiaries, or other targeted groups, and at what cost or relative priority for the various benefits or various beneficiaries. It also, principle 5, looks at board means policies. Now, this is all probably sounding a little abstract, but this is why you have to do the required reading. But board means policies under principle 5 speaks to the definition in writing of the behaviors, values, principles, and conduct of the board itself, and of the board's delegation and accountability relationship with the management of the organization. Then you have principles 8 to 10, which deals with board's delegation and monitoring. So I wouldn't put you on the spot, but certainly you should be thinking about your organization and to the extent to which these things apply. And do you have these types of principles in place? Oh, sorry, Michael has a question. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, quick question. Can you hear me?
I can't hear you if you're speaking. Michael?
Hello? Hello?
Hello?
Hello?
Micah, I'm not hearing you. You
Hello?
don't know, you may want to test your mic, or you may want to use the chat function.
Hello? Hello?
So if you get the mic started, please interrupt as soon as you do. Or, like I said, use the chat function. But as I was saying, you should be thinking in terms of your own organizations and to the extent to which these apply. All right, let me check the chat. One moment, please. Oh, so everyone is hearing Michael but me. All right, try again, Michael.
Oh, hello?
Oh, no, I'm hearing you. So maybe it was my volume. Go ahead.
Okay, great. So I wanted to ask a question in terms of, so sometimes like small organizations have what are known as working boards.
Yes.
And so how does that tie into the difference between governance and sorry, the other term, which I've forgotten all of a sudden.
It's the, okay, yeah. So I think somewhere I raised this question, but what happens when there is no separation? And this is a reality for many small organizations where you cannot afford to have staff and management per se. You have executive directors. This can work, but it means you will have to have very clear measures in place to ensure that you're still able to achieve the various objectives of the organization. You may want to look at, to the extent possible, I don't know how big the board is, but having committees of the board so that there's still the ability to have some delegation and some overview process in place. So if you're big enough to have subcommittees, and subcommittees really can be, it can be a couple of people, but it allows for delegation, assessment, and monitoring. If it's a case that you have a working board and you may have some volunteers working for you, or maybe just a couple low-level staff, what have you, again, it's going to be about the board's ability to monitor, assess, and measure against clear objectives. So I suspect what you're asking would be applicable to many of the CSOs within this training program. And I would I would say have clear policies, and importantly, have systems to measure what you're doing. And if you can delegate and have subcommittees and so on so that you can separate some roles, I would also suggest you use that model. Sorry, there's some, okay, thanks. You're welcome. Let me go back. The thing is, even where you are unable to have those types of separations, you still want to be covering as much of the board activities as possible. So you want to ensure you're planning and evaluating, as I have written here. You have committee involvement, and this thing, fiduciary responsibility. Now, this is actually very, very important for under the companies that, for those of you that might be established as not-for-profits, and even under the Charities Act, you have certain responsibilities that are legal responsibilities, and certainly under the Barbados Companies Act, and I suspect for the rest of the Caribbean, the Companies Act actually stipulates specific responsibilities of directors, so that people will often assume the responsibility of being a director for an organization without truly understanding that they're taking on a legal responsibility for which they can be held legally accountable. I don't know for equals and SOCTA, etc., how you're structured, but certainly if you want, I can extract that information from our local legislation and post it so that you have a better understanding of the actual legal responsibilities of directors. Anyway, moving on. Whilst the policy governance model is actually a very well-known and highly referenced one, there are some criticisms about it as applied to not-for-profits. Mainly because it's found to have a very corporate perspective, and there are concerns about the ability of nonprofits to be able to innovate and change and respond to the needs of the stakeholders, and instead become wrapped up in, things such as productivity and accountability and financials and so on. My feeling is that nonprofits generally will have a very different set of objectives from for-profits. Nonetheless, they still need to ensure that they're well functioning financially, that they achieve certain objectives such as low administrative costs, etc. So I personally think that what is required is a good balance. And when back here where it says about trustee characteristics, I think this is also a very key aspect, because often you will have the trustees or the directors very much, sorry, what's that? The trustees and directors are very often volunteers and may operate at the varying levels of expertise and experience. What is that? Is that somebody here? And sorry. And because of that, they may not run the organization very well, to be honest. So you then have a challenge where maybe they may be good at, going out and selling cakes and doing fundraising and all that. But in fact, in terms of being able to truly offer the sort of skills required to ensure the organization functions properly, they're very weak in that regard. So is the model too corporate focused? Maybe, but it does have some strengths in terms of helping the organization to function more effectively. You then have another model, and I must admit there are quite a few of them. I didn't think you need to really, learn all the theory. You can do additional reading if it's your interest. But there's a model of interest which looks at the representativeness or the representative or constituent model, where the board members are also the constituents or stakeholders themselves, or members of the organization. So we have ACCS here with Kanisha Hewitt, and the ACCS is made up of organizations which are member-run organizations, and the boards, for the most part, come directly from membership. And there would be, usually with these types of organizations, they will have rules that stipulate all or the majority of the board should be from membership. The rules will also seek to ensure that the various categories of membership are represented on the board. And as a result, these can be fairly large boards because of the, depending on the type of organization, the various categories and interests represented. And although for the purpose of this course, they're not included, a typical example would actually be a credit union or a union. And because of the size, et cetera, and the nature of the board, there's heavy delegation to the CEO by the board. Now, this concept of delegation by the board sets, simply put, the board sets policy and the executive implement it. So outside of the smaller organizations where there may be no separation between the executive and the board of directors or the trustees, this can become a real challenge for organizations. Because why? One, you can have very often directors not understanding or appreciating the separation, governance versus management. And you'll often find directors who want to intervene in the management or behave like they're one of the managers or staff. You also have that actually as a complication where you can have instances where you have staff who are directors. And I personally have had that experience, and I'll share a little bit about that. You can have, and this goes back to the need to have trustees or directors who have a variety of relevant skills and experience. Because if you have a board, a membership board, and the members are not necessarily professional people or have, strong organizational management skills, you may find the board having a heavy reliance on the professional manager, on the CEO or general manager, or whatever the term is that you use. And therefore empowering the CEO. And you could then have that first problem I spoke of, the agency problem. Because then when you have a very strong executive and who actually know more about the runnings of the organization than the directors or trustees, you may find that the executive is then doing whatever they feel like. And if the board doesn't have in place strong policies and methods of monitoring and evaluation, you see the management doing as they feel like, and the poor board having no real understanding of what's going on with the organization. So whilst it's good to have the interests of the members or the constituents represented on the board, I keep returning to that comment made on the Carver policy model, in that you still have to ensure there's a good balance between the corporate objectives versus let's call them the softer organizational objectives. So my experience was where I do my day job. I do manage a company. It's a not-for-profit. It is a member-run board. And unfortunately for me, I had a staff member who was also a director. And that was a situation I came and found, and I immediately had an issue with it because there's a governance, it's hard to, it's like having an employee who's also your boss, or at least that was his understanding of it. And in a sister organization, one of the other islands, it was even worse. They had the employee was also the chairman. So on the one hand, the chief executive was reporting to this person as chairperson, and then that person will report this chief executive as an employee. Ridiculous. Really poor governance situations. So in my experience, what happened was because the obvious happened. What you would expect happened. The employee figured he was really my boss. I couldn't tell him what to do. And he didn't function. And I fired him. And the board, which were all his friends, rehired him. And we had a repeat. It was not functioning. So, it was either he goes or I go. And he went. But as horrible as that situation was, I don't think it is a unique one at all. So you would need to think about your organizations where you do have staff, or even if they're not paid staff, at least there's a board and maybe volunteers, for example. And where these are membership type organizations, are you representing, or does the board represent the membership of the organization adequately? Does the board have on it the relevant skill set? And have you created situations that may lead to very poor governance structures in terms of the relationships? Right, so these questions here go back to the various issues of concerns which I just discussed. And you'll see the last point speaks to the question raised by Michael: governance versus management when there's no staff. So I spoke to that. Spoke to the capacity to govern effectively on behalf of constituents and the larger community. How can an organization contribute to a democratic society if there's a democratic deficit in its own governance? So you are trying to achieve your various objectives because of the nature of what you're doing. In effect, all of you are pretty much focused on improving livelihoods, etc. But you have to start at home. And if within your own organization you don't have things properly set up, how do you think you can truly contribute beyond your organization? I also spoke to the issues of having effective representation for the public generally, or your target audience, or your public, however that is defined, and stakeholders. And that's the first point. And that's the first point because you have to be able to clearly and quickly state, if I asked you, what or who make up the public for your organization? Who are your stakeholders? Do you have some level of prioritization? Are you treating them all equally? If you say you're treating them all equally, what are the policies and activities and strategies and so on that you have in place to actually prove what you're saying? So I have a video to show you. Now, of course, let me go back. I have to, 1 second, I have to be able to pull the video from the presentation. So give me a second, I'm going to stop sharing the presentation and then I'll show the video. So 1 moment. Oh, Erica. So I'm sorry because I'm not the most technologically advanced, but I think I can get this done. Safari, paste. Oh, okay. So I start the video and then I have to share the screen. Right, stop. Share screen. Share. Here's the video. Oh, okay, so I'm ready. All right, there's a chat. What are you saying? Who's talking? Sorry, Michael. Oh, sorry. All right, I don't know if you're laughing at me, Michael, But don't worry, I have it sorted. So let me start again. Share. Here we go. I hope you can see. So let me start.
The big issue, I think, is over the concept of clarity of roles and responsibilities. You know, does the board know what, you know, their side of the equation is versus the chief executive? And that's been talked about in many different ways, you know, throughout. Boards need to be doing meaningful work and not be caught up in the mundane. And so it has to be the type of work that really, really excites them. And so recent research called Governance as Leadership looked at some of the problems that boards have, and one of their grand conclusions in this research said that it's always not problems of performance, but rather it's problems of purpose. So boards need to be constantly asking themselves, what are we trying to accomplish? What's our purpose? What's the value added that we're bringing to this organization? How is that different and unique? If you can solve the purpose question, I think people are going to show up at meetings. I think they're going to do what they say they're going to do. I think all of this other stuff is going to fall in line, but a lot of it comes down to what's the purpose.
I served on a board that included a number of people who were first-time ever board members. The majority of people had never served on a board before. And so there was a real challenge in terms of those folks understanding the difference between management and governance. And this was also an early stage organization. And so initially we did need board members to roll up their sleeve and help getting stuff done. And then as the organization matured, those same board members needed to adjust to being hands-off and overseeing and setting strategy and priorities, not doing the job of the executive director or his or her staff. And so that adjustment over time was really, really challenging.
I think some of the big challenges that board members will face are, number one, just kind of taking the time to get up to speed. It's not unusual for it to take a year before you fully understand the mission of the organization. You develop bonds with the people on the board. So I think have a long-term vision about the potential you'd like this organization to achieve, and really look not only to help intellectually drive that, but to be a contributing part of the culture of the organization.
Finances can become all-consuming, and they're obviously crucially important, but they also can suck all the air out of the room and close the door on other things which can drive the organisation forward. So there's got to be a mix of dealing with the present and actually planning for the future. A mix of being pragmatic and sensible, very practical about what we need to do right now to keep this ship afloat, and some exciting and visionary planning for the future, because what's going to keep you slogging through the hard times is the goal of what you're going to do longer term.
I think the toughest thing as a board member is when the organization is drifting from what you want, what you thought it should do, and you're not sure if it's because people don't care or somebody is intentionally taking it somewhere else, or just ineffective management of the board or by the board. And you spend a certain amount of time trying to change that and impact it and understand from it, just understand what's happening, grow from it, and it doesn't go there. And you struggle with what's your fiduciary obligation to the group, to that organization, and to the beneficiaries of it. Not the board members, not the staff, but the beneficiaries. You struggle with what is my fiduciary obligation to them, and those children. And if I'm frustrated with this, can I just leave? Is it my duty to change things, even if I may be a minority? What is my duty? That's the toughest thing you're going to do as a board, as a director.
Okay. So let me fumble again. Stop sharing. I will now pull back up the PowerPoint. So the last slide was meant as a discussion slide. I don't know if anyone wants to volunteer and speak to the governance structure of their CSO and what they consider to be the primary governance issues. We don't have a lot of time, so if one person is oh sorry, that's actually one of my directors WhatsApping, so let me shut him up. But if there are any volunteers who want to speak about governance within their organization, challenges and any solutions or strategies undertaken to address those solutions. And one more thing to think about, do you think the current governance situation of your organization can impact your ability to implement your communications plan, your communication and advocacy plan? So that's a lot, but one person, do we have any volunteers? And let me just say that you can think about these questions. And I had previously advised that, you know, the participation in the stream of the Google Classroom would also count as participation for the purpose of assessing you in this program. So even if you can't think of responses at this point, please feel free to share your thoughts and experiences in the Google Classroom. So any volunteers?
I guess I can.
Okay, go ahead.
So when we first established, you know, obviously, like a lot of persons who are setting up our organization aren't very good with technical language and setting up a constitution and whatnot. So we had that set up for us, and it turned out that the person that did our constitution actually did a very bad constitution, and so it didn't have a hierarchy, and so it was very much all like co-directors of this organization. And so there were actually not really any roles defined either, which we just got sorted out with having someone review our constitution, and then we called a special meeting of the members and voted in the new constitution, where we then had a annual general meeting and officially voted on the board of directors, because before then we didn't have any AGMs and any voting of the board of directors since then. So we've just got that sorted out with proper roles defined and a better management system, a better governance, system in regard to the
So does okay, you've got there, but have you done any like policy documents? Do you do any strategic planning or anything like that as yet? Michael? Michael? Oh, can you still hear me, anyone? Hello? All right, let's see. Oh, well, I'm sorry. I don't know what happened. Let me stop sharing and see. Hello? All right, I don't know what happened.
I can hear you, Erica.
Oh, I can hear you, Wendy. It's just Michael. Michael isn't there anymore, actually. He just dropped out. That's the problem. He's not, he's not there anymore. But did he respond to my question? Okay.
No, he faded. So the same time you stopped hearing him, I stopped hearing him as well.
Okay, well, Kanisha has here, how do you encourage, for lack of a better word, some board members who do not play an active role, but refuse to set aside or still participate in elections? This is, in my view, a challenge to move the organization forward. Well, Kanisha, in fact, I can answer very specifically in terms of your organization. Since I'm part of the grouping, and we decided to, at a regional level, to address the issue of incompetent, let's say, or non-active directors, that we wanted to implement a standard within all of our organizations where we have one, competency-based boards. So where we will identify the specific skill sets that are required of directors and proactively seek to recruit directors who meet those skills. You have tools where you monitor and evaluate director performance. And in fact, in countries like the UK, you have to report in your annual reports things like director attendance, the level of attendance at meetings, how they're remunerated, etc. So the aim is to have evaluation systems for directors, and basically, if you don't perform effectively, that is very clearly pointed out. This issue of stepping aside. Personally, I believe that directors should have to step down after a period of time, not necessarily permanently, but at least for a couple of years. Why? If you have directors, the same directors for a decade or more on a board, what happens inevitably is you start to get a lack of innovation, and you don't get the sort of regeneration that's required by the organization. You also have issues concerning succession, because you may want to be there forever, but the fact is, if the organization is to be sustained and to have a long life, you have to prepare for succession and the entry of new people, etc. So board member, this idea of you being able to sit on a board indefinitely, I personally do not think it's a good one. You can go away for a couple of years and come back. There is some value in terms of the experience, etc., that a long-serving director will have, but there's also a great danger. And you would try to, in order to have institutional knowledge and so on, not to have all directors retire at the same time. So if you have a board of say 8 persons, maybe 3 retire now and 3 later, and you kind of rotate in that regard. So that was in response to Kanisha's question. Now, Michael, I see you're back. We are pretty much out of time, but I did want to hear your response. I had asked whether, okay, you just worked out your bylaws, your constitution, you've had your AGM, but in terms of planning, and policy development. Have you developed policies for the organization? Do you do an annual work plan, strategy, etc.? Do you have those types of tools in place? Michael? Okay. All right. Well, I don't know what happened with Michael, but I'll wrap up. I'm going to stop the recording just now. I previously shared the email conceptualization@consultant.com. I've invited you to, you can reach out individually with any comments or queries. You can share, as I said before, your experiences, etc., on the Google Classroom stream, which I strongly encourage you to do. If you're interested in learning more about the legal duties of directors, just let me know, and I will post. I'll post from the Barbados Companies Act and maybe from one of the other islands as well. So just send a note in the Google stream and let me know if you're interested in that. Otherwise, I hope it was a useful class. And I think it's a very, very important subject for the proper functioning of the CSOs. So I encourage you to do additional reading as recommended to learn more about the subject and to apply it to your organization. Thank you and good night.